January 2025. The world stood still. From the cobbled stones of St. Peter's Square to the silent hills beyond Rome, hearts were heavy. Pope Francis, beloved shepherd of the modern age, was gone. There are silences that are ordinary, and then there are silences that feel like the earth itself is holding its breath. This was the latter. St. Peter's Square, usually alive with the footsteps of tourists and the soft hum of reverent chatter, was transformed into a solemn cathedral under the open sky. The cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims, seemed almost to mourn. Their cold, ancient surface now held the weight of a grief too deep for words. Above, the skies were cloaked in a somber gray, as if heaven itself had veiled its face. The clouds hung low, not quite crying, but full, heavy with unshed tears, mirroring the eyes of those below. Even the wind, which so often dances playfully around the columns of Bernini's grand colonnade, was still, as though it, too, was observing the sacred moment. Millions of people stood, some shoulder to shoulder, others miles apart, but united through broadcast, drawn together not by religion alone, but by reverence, for a man who had transcended his title, for a shepherd who had dared to walk among his sheep. The crimson of the cardinals' robes flickered like muted flames amid the sea of black coats and mourning veils. They stood like sentinels, unmoving, their faces a mixture of sorrow, reflection, and solemn duty. Behind them, rows of world leaders and foreign dignitaries sat rigid, their roles as heads of state momentarily eclipsed by their presence as human beings, humbled mourners in the house of God. Pilgrims from every continent clutched rosaries, crosses, photographs, tokens of moments shared, blessings received, prayers answered. A woman from the Philippines knelt barefoot on the cold stone, hands pressed together. A man from Argentina wept quietly, the flag of his homeland draped around his shoulders. Nearby, children who had only ever seen Pope Francis on television clutched candles, unsure why they felt so sad, but understanding instinctively that something sacred had passed. No music played. No voice dared interrupt. Even the camera crews, so often intrusive, moved like ghosts, trying not to disturb what felt like the breath between two worlds. It was in this holy hush that the funeral of Pope Francis began, not with trumpet or proclamation, but with a silence so pure, so full of shared emotion, that it felt like the entire world was kneeling. And for a brief, unforgettable moment, the Vatican became the beating heart of the human spirit. To the outside world, he looked like any other member of the famed pontifical Swiss Guard, tall, poised, armored in the unmistakable Renaissance uniform of deep blue, crimson, and gold. But beneath the carefully crafted stoicism, Luca Moretti's heart was pounding. It was his first state funeral, his first moment guarding the soul of the Vatican in front of the world. And not just any funeral. This was Pope Francis, the man Luca had grown up hearing about not just as a religious leader, but as a symbol of hope, a revolutionary voice of gentleness in a time of noise. Luca's posture was perfect, exactly as he had been trained. Feet at attention, halberd upright, gaze fixed into the middle distance. Every motion, every breath, choreographed down to the second. The Swiss Guard prided itself on unbreakable discipline, on being both warrior and statue. But today, Luca felt like a boy inside the armor. He remembered the day he received his assignment. His mother had wept when the letter came, equal parts pride and fear. His father, a quiet farmer, had merely nodded and placed a hand on his shoulder. Serve with honor, he had said, and Luca had promised he would. Yet now, standing just meters from the Pope's casket, he felt something he hadn't anticipated, a tremble in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with loss. The man lying in that casket had never met Luca, but his teachings had found their way to him in ways sermons never could. When Luca's grandfather passed away, it was Pope Francis's words, soft, humble, deeply human, that comforted the family. When Luca doubted his purpose in the early days of training, it was the Pope's reminder that service is love in motion that gave him strength. And now, here he was, tasked with guarding a man who had unknowingly guarded him his whole life. He wasn't supposed to feel. Not here. Not now. But the ache in his chest betrayed the rules written in centuries of tradition, because beneath the polished helmet and steel-trimmed armor, Luca was just a son, a grandson, a believer, mourning a spiritual father. He blinked, forcing his eyes to stay dry. But emotion is a stubborn tide, and on that sacred day, even the most unshakable soldier would find it hard not to break. Among the rows of stoic, disciplined young men in the Swiss Guard, each hand-picked and rigorously trained, Luca Moretti stood apart, not because of how he looked, but because of the story that had brought him here. He wasn't born into wealth or nobility, as many assumed of those serving inside Vatican walls. Luca came from a quiet, snow-covered village near Interlaken, where the days were slow and the people simple. His family lived in a small chalet nestled at the foot of the mountains, where faith was passed down not in grand cathedrals, but in whispered bedtime prayers and meals shared around a worn oak table. But Luca's path to the Vatican began long before he was even born, with his grandfather, Matteo. Matteo Moretti had once made a pilgrimage to Rome as a young man, a journey of deep personal healing after surviving the loss of his wife. During that trip, he had attended a general audience in St. Peter's Square, one where Pope Francis, still early in his papacy, had spoken not from a place of authority, but from deep, empathetic understanding. He had spoken of suffering, of loneliness, and of finding God not in miracles, but in moments. That encounter changed Matteo. He returned home with a peace he hadn't felt in years. From then on, Pope Francis was more than a pope to the Moretti family. He was a thread of comfort, a light in difficult times. When Luca was born, Matteo had cradled him and whispered, "This one will serve the church." At the time, it was only a hopeful blessing. But as Luca grew older, it began to echo in his heart like a quiet calling. He applied to the Swiss Guard at 19, barely eligible, full of nerves. He trained for years, enduring not only the physical demands, but the emotional weight of duty. And through every moment of hardship, every cold night of self-doubt, he kept a photo of his grandfather standing in St. Peter's Square, smiling with the dome behind him. Now, standing at the heart of that same square, Luca wasn't just a guard following orders. He was a grandson fulfilling a legacy, a young man who had walked a road paved by memory, reverence, and faith. Most people there that day saw him as one of many, but if they had looked closer, if they had truly looked, they would have seen it in his eyes. Luca wasn't guarding the Pope because he had to. He was guarding him because he owed him. And grief that deep has a way of breaking through even the strictest of rules. The ritual had followed its sacred rhythm, ancient Latin prayers rising like incense into the sky, the deep echo of hymns reverberating through the marble columns of St. Peter's Basilica, and the measured cadence of the choir carrying centuries of tradition in every note. And then came the final prayer. It was the moment everyone had been dreading, the moment where words would attempt to put an end to a life that had touched millions, knowing full well that no prayer, no matter how holy, could ever truly contain the man that Pope Francis had been. As the final Requiem Aeternam Dona Ei Domini rang out, a weight seemed to descend upon the square. It was not just liturgical. It was emotional, visceral, like time itself had paused to pay its respects. Every head bowed, every voice stilled, the rustling of coats, the clicking of cameras, even the sound of footsteps faded into nothing. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the earth beneath the stones. The coffin, simple, humble, as he had requested, rested beneath the looming altar, surrounded by flickering candles and a bed of white lilies. The papal seal etched gently into the wood seemed almost too quiet, too small, for the legacy it marked. Behind it, Pope Francis's fisherman's ring, symbol of his authority, had already been removed, never to be worn again. It sat beside the folded papal vestments, waiting to be buried with him, and around it all stood the people. Some clutched rosaries, others photographs. Some prayed with conviction, others with confusion. But they were united in one thing, the unspoken ache of goodbye. The cardinals lowered their heads. The dignitaries remained frozen in reverence. Children nestled in their mothers' arms stopped fidgeting. Even the birds above the square, which often fluttered without fear, circled silently, as if they too understood something sacred was happening. And there, just beyond the shadow of the obelisk, stood Luca, still at attention, but no longer breathing with ease. His grip on his halberd had tightened. His eyes, though disciplined, shimmered just slightly with the weight of a moment too large for any uniform to carry. The final amen echoed off the walls like a bell tolling not just for the end of a life, but the closing of an era. And then, silence. Not empty, but full. Full of grief, full of love, full of all the things that no liturgy could capture. A silence so deep, so profound that it invited something unscripted. And Luca, his heart pounding louder than the bells, felt it stir within him. Something was about to happen. Something that no one, especially not the Vatican, was prepared for. At first, no one noticed. The square was still blanketed in silence, the kind that clings to the skin and burrows into the soul. Even the smallest sound would have felt intrusive, too loud for grief, too bold for holiness. But then came the sound of a single footstep, sharp, deliberate, out of rhythm. Luca Moretti had moved, just one step at first, barely noticeable to the sea of mourners. But to the trained eyes of the Vatican ceremonial staff, and especially to the other guards, it was a rupture in the choreography that had been rehearsed down to the breath. Another step, then a third, 3 paces forward, enough to break the formation, enough to draw eyes, enough to shatter centuries of protocol that demanded absolute stillness during the Pope's final rites. Gasps didn't echo, but they pulsed, low and scattered through the congregation like ripples in a sacred pool. A fellow guard, standing just feet away, glanced sideways, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his helmet. A senior Vatican aide furrowed his brow. Camera operators, poised in high vantage points, began to zoom in, confused and alert. To an outsider, it might have looked like a mistake, a lapse in training, a nervous misstep. But this wasn't hesitation. It was choice. Luca's movement was slow, reverent, more like a pilgrim approaching a shrine than a soldier abandoning his post. His halberd remained gripped tightly in one hand, his other curled into a trembling fist at his side. His head stayed bowed, not in shame, but in reverence. He walked not toward the crowd, not toward any cardinal or dignitary, but toward the casket, toward him, toward the man who had never known Luca's name, but who had touched the deepest corners of his soul. And in those 3 forbidden steps, Luca crossed an invisible line, one that separates duty from devotion, rules from remembrance. Behind him, silence deepened, the kind that doesn't just mark a break in sound, but the beginning of something extraordinary, because everyone knew what they had just witnessed. A Swiss guard, trained to be unshakable, unwavering, immovable, had broken rank, not for power, not for glory, but for love. And the Vatican, so used to control, so defined by ritual, was about to be shaken to its core. For a heartbeat, time froze. Millions were watching, on cathedral steps, in living rooms, on mobile screens, cradled in shaking hands across continents. From Buenos Aires to Birmingham, from Seoul to Seattle, eyes were locked on one young man standing alone before the Pope's coffin. Luca Moretti had done the unthinkable, and the question now rippling across the square and around the world, wasn't just what he had done, but what would happen next. Inside the Vatican, where everything is measured, rehearsed, and consecrated by tradition, breaches of protocol are rare and often unforgiven. The Swiss Guard is one of the oldest military units in the world, renowned not for combat, but for absolute discipline. Their movements are symbolic. Their silence, sacred. To step out of line, especially in a moment as globally sacred as the Pope's funeral, was not just a mistake. It was a rupture in the Vatican's ceremonial fabric. Some in the crowd recoiled slightly, unsure if they just witnessed a scandal unfold before their eyes. Others leaned forward, hands over mouths, instinctively moved not by shock, but by something else, something deeper. The cameras, zoomed in on Luca, began to flicker across news outlets and live streams like wildfire. Headlines were already being typed in newsrooms around the world. Swiss Guard breaks rank at Pope's funeral. Unexpected disruption in St. Peter's Square. Protocol breached during final blessing. But what none of them knew, not yet, was that this was not the beginning of a scandal. It was the beginning of a moment. Because despite the breaking of rules, despite the shocked glances of Vatican officials and murmurs among the clergy, no one moved to stop him. Not a single hand was raised. Not a command was given. And that silence, the silence of those who should have intervened, said everything. They, too, were feeling it. That what Luca had done wasn't a disruption. It was a devotion. A gesture so raw, so human, so unguarded, that it pierced through centuries of ceremony and struck something far more eternal. And the world, though stunned, began to feel it too. The weight of what was no longer tradition, but truth. It was imperceptible at first. A flicker, a shift. Luca, still standing only steps from the coffin, his eyes brimming but locked in place, saw it before anyone else. Emotion so small it could have been imagined, but it wasn't. The Pope's right hand, folded neatly across his chest in eternal rest, moved, not dramatically, not like the stories of saints rising, just a subtle, unmistakable gesture. His fingers, long and worn from years of blessing and service, twitched and then opened, just slightly. Gasps echoed across the square, not orchestrated, not theatrical, but sharp and real. You could feel it like a ripple slicing through still water. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" A camera operator dropped his headset. One of the cardinals took an instinctive step forward. Luca froze, unable to process what he was seeing. His training told him it wasn't possible. His logic told him the mind sometimes invents comfort in moments of great pain. But his soul, knew something holy was unfolding. And then, it happened again. The hand, still and lifeless just seconds ago, extended slowly, deliberately, toward him, as if reaching, as if blessing, as if, in death, the Pope had one final moment left. And he had chosen this one. Tears that had welled in Luca's eyes now broke free, tracing silent paths down his cheeks. His halberd trembled in his grip. His lips parted, but no words came. Because what words could meet a miracle? The Vatican officials were stunned. Dignitaries looked to one another in disbelief. Some priests crossed themselves instinctively. Others simply wept. The cameras captured it all, broadcasting it in real time. Images that would be replayed for generations, debated by theologians, skeptics, and scholars alike. But in that moment, it didn't matter whether it was miracle, muscle spasm, or mystery. What mattered was what it meant. That the man who had lived a life of breaking walls and building bridges had, in his very last gesture, reached not for power, but for one humble soul. And he had chosen Luca. It was just a moment, just a hand, just a movement. But in the Vatican, a place built on centuries of ritual, order, and tradition, it was as if the earth had tilted on its axis. Theologians would soon argue over what they had seen. Was it divine? A final impulse of the body? A symbol? A sign? A coincidence? The debates would rage for years in seminaries, newsrooms, and quiet coffee shops, filled with the faithful and the doubtful alike. But none of that mattered to the people who were there. They hadn't seen theology. They hadn't seen protocol or doctrine. They had seen love, pure, undiluted, impossible love, in its final breath. Lucas stood, no longer a guard, no longer an orphan of command, but as a witness, a vessel for something beyond comprehension. He hadn't asked for it, hadn't expected it, but in breaking protocol, he had made room for something bigger than obedience. He had made room for grace. And grace did what grace always does when invited in. It rewrote the script. The Vatican's response came not with punishment, but with reverence. No one scolded him. No order was barked. Instead, a senior cardinal, his hands visibly shaking, stepped forward, placed his hand on Luca's shoulder, and whispered, "You were called, and you answered." From that day on, Luca Moretti's name echoed in places where Swiss guards were never meant to be remembered. Letters poured in from across the globe. Parents told their children the story of the guard who dared to love out loud. Artists painted him. Writers tried to explain him. Pilgrims whispered prayers near the spot he stood, believing it now holy ground. And though the church never issued a formal declaration of miracle, deep inside the archives of the Vatican, a private letter was preserved, handwritten by the Pope's personal physician, dated the day of the funeral. It read simply, medically unexplainable. But then again, love always is. The world moved on, as it always does. Headlines faded. Debates quieted. New leaders emerged. New challenges arose. But some stories never truly end. They echo, gently, through time. And the story of the young Swiss guard who broke protocol at Pope Francis's funeral became one of them. In the heart of St. Peter's Square, just a few steps from where the Pope's coffin had once rested beneath a gray sky, a small bronze plaque was quietly placed, not by official decree, but by quiet insistence from the faithful. It read, "Here stood Luca Moretti, whose devotion moved the world." Each year on the anniversary of the funeral, people come. Some kneel, some light candles, some simply stand in silence, hoping to feel even a fraction of what had happened that day. Not all of them are Catholic. Not all are religious. But all are drawn by the same invisible thread, the story of one man's quiet act of courage in the presence of death and divinity. As for Luca, he never returned to the guard. After the funeral, he requested release from service, not out of disgrace, but out of peace. He said what needed to be said had been said, not in words, but in presence, and that his true duty had been fulfilled not by standing still, but by stepping forward. He returned to his village near Interlaken, to the snow, the quiet, and the familiar scent of pine trees. There, he lived simply, teaching, farming, writing. He never granted interviews, never published a memoir, but every Sunday, without fail, he visited his grandfather's grave and left a single white lily. And though he faded from the headlines, his story became something far more powerful, a modern parable, a reminder that sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is to break the rules for love.